Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the May installment of the Alumni Lunch and Learn series at the L. Douglas Wilder School of Government and Public Affairs at VCU. Today's session is titled Why No Cyber Shock and Awe: The Digital Dimensions and Implications of Russia's War on Ukraine, with our speakers, Assistant Professor Christopher White and Associate Professor James Keck. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, the Wilder School hosts free virtual events monthly like this one. Each session features change agents, thought leaders, policymakers who provide insights and commentary on relevant topics of the day. Next slide. My name is Stephen Dozier, and I am the Director of Development and Alumni Engagement here at the Wilder School. Next slide. Before we get started, we are excited to announce that we are rising in the rankings. The Wilder School is #1 ranked graduate program for public affairs in Virginia and ranked in the top 15% in the nation by U.S. News and World Report. The school rose from number 35 in the nation among public affairs graduate schools, which is up from 38 in 2022. The Wilder School's Public Management and Leadership program also climbed to number 29, rising from number 34 in 2022 in the report's specialty program rankings. We are proud to be at the forefront of our field. Next slide. In addition, here are our graduate program application deadlines for fall 2022. Contact Ross Lasevio with questions, which the email will be provided in the chat. If you haven't heard, our award-winning Master of Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness and Master of Public Administration programs are available online. The application deadlines are July 1 for the MPA program and July 25th for the Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness program. Use the link on the slide and in the chat to apply. Lastly, the spring 2022 edition of the Wilder School in Action magazine is available online. The link is also in the chat. Now, a word from Dr. Susan Gooden, Dean and Professor at the Wilder School Government and Public Affairs. Sorry.
Thanks so much, Stephen, and welcome everyone. I am delighted that you have joined us, that you're joining us for today's Lunch and Learn about a topic that I know we've all been following closely, looking at the situation in Ukraine. And I know that we will all learn a lot today, and we invite you to engage in this discussion and share your comments and questions. It is my honor to introduce our moderator for today's session, who is Mr. Jim Keck. Jim Keck is an associate professor in Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness here in the Wilder School. But I wanted to say a little bit more than I would normally say about Jim, because in addition to him serving as moderator here today, he is also ending his career with us. He is going to retire from VCU, and I think this will be his third retirement because he's had a lifetime of service to the Commonwealth of Virginia and in the military. And I did want to take a moment to share that because I have tremendous respect for Jim. I've worked with him for a number of years, and I'm delighted that he is moderating today's session. He brings more than 45 years of successful experience in emergency management, homeland security, financial management, and healthcare administration. Before he came to us at VCU, he had served as Deputy State Director for the Virginia Department of Emergency Management, VDEM. He retired from there in 2008, where he had a lot of responsibility related to finance and federal homeland security grants as well. Jim worked very, very closely with the governor's office and the General Assembly on legislative bills and state homeland security and emergency management policy. I know that we have a lot of folks who are joining today who may know Jim from his professional associations, and his work and reputation in the Virginia Department of Emergency Management is stellar. He also has served as the executive director of the Virginia Emergency Management Association, which is a professional organization of emergency managers here in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And he was recognized by the International Association of Emergency Managers with the 2014 Student Advocate of the Year Award. So Jim has just done a lot over the years in emergency management in multiple capacities. This does not include his 21 years of service in the United States Air Force Medical Corps, where he served in Saudi Arabia as the Chief Medical Administrative Officer for the Air Force during the Gulf War. So Jim, thank you for all of your excellent service and outstanding public service that you have given to the field of emergency management, not only to higher education, but to the state, the Commonwealth of Virginia, and to all of us in your military service as well. Jim, we're going to miss you, and I'll turn it over to you now to moderate this session.
Thank you, Susan. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Chris White, who is an assistant professor of Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness in the Wilder School. His research currently focuses on the decision-making dynamics of cyber operations, the role of fringe virtual spaces in supporting influence campaigns, and the impact of artificial intelligence on cyber conflict dynamics. He is author of nearly 30 peer-reviewed articles on these subjects and 2 books on cyber conflict. In recent months, he has offered much expert commentary and analysis on the cyber conflict dimensions of the Russo-Ukrainian war, particularly on the role of non-state combatants in the conflict. He is also co-author of Information in War, a book on artificial intelligence and military innovation, published by Georgetown University Press this summer. And his most recent research, which was published last month in the Journal of Cybersecurity, examines the strategic culture of national institutions that build and decide how to use cyber capabilities to secure national security objectives. With all due respect, Chris, it's all yours.
Great, thank you very much, Jim. And let me go ahead and add my thanks to you specifically for moderating this session. We've been colleagues for quite a while, and you are on the brink of what hopefully is ultimately your actual retirement. It's an absolute honor being your colleague and having you moderate this session as your last big thing out the door. So thank you. Thank you, everyone who had a hand in inviting me here today. I'm pleased to come along and to be able to offer a little bit of context and a little bit of perspective, hopefully on a part of the Russo-Ukrainian war, Putin's invasion, whatever you'd like to call it, that is regularly, I think, reported on in bits and pieces. You know, you hear about interesting hacks on Russian media, channels, and cyber attacks on Ukrainian energy grid infrastructure and so on. But the digital dimension of the conflict as a whole isn't so well known. And so my aim today is to offer just a little bit of context as to what we have seen so far, some of the takeaways that myself and other researchers like me have at this juncture. This is obviously an evolving picture that we have to assess, a month from now, a year from now, and onwards. But also to think, hopefully, with some good contextual clarity about what we might expect from the Russians in particular going forward. The Russians, of course, probably being the number one cyber belligerent of focus for our national security efforts here in the United States, going back 4 decades almost. I mean, most people, they think about cyber conflict if they're asked about it, and they think, oh, it's the thing that happened and it's been happening since the 2000s or in the 2010s. This is This is a domain of national security interest going back 40 years at this point already. Going back 40 years, we can see the Russians at the heart of efforts to make us more insecure. And so this is a new chapter. So I hopefully can offer some interesting context here today. The next slide, please. So the digital dimension of this conflict. This is quite an interesting, tragically interesting circumstance we're going to talk about here today. We're seeing the application of not just conventional military capabilities by the Russians in invading Ukraine, but also electronic warfare, hybrid warfare, information warfare, cyber operations, and we're seeing it under almost unprecedented circumstances. That is to say, this is, cyber operations, information warfare during a hot war, an actual shooting war in which two armies are actively engaged against one another. That is novel for a great many reasons. As I just said, cyber conflict goes back 40 years. We can trace major incidents that have cost billions of dollars, have affected and threatened our national security, our industry, our infrastructure, going back decades. But this is really the first circumstance where we have capable cyber combatants launching attacks against one another, launching attacks against each other's societies in the context of an actual shooting war. That's almost unprecedented. And I say it's almost unprecedented, specifically because, of course, this is the latest manifestation of hostilities between Ukraine and Russia. If we go back to late 2013, the refusal of the Yanukovych government in Kyiv to sign an agreement towards greater economic engagement with the European Union prompted the Euromaidan protests, a series of protests that drew hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians who wanted greater economic engagement with the EU to the capital. And for about 95 days, there were major protests. There was violence as the Yanukovych government tried to crack down on these protests. And that period ended with the then pro-Russian president, Yanukovych, fleeing to Russia. And in the weeks and months that followed, the government reformed itself. It did so in a democratic fashion, and we get much of the government infrastructure we see today in Ukraine. That event, of course, kicked off a series of confrontations with Russia. Barely about two and a half weeks after Yanukovych fled the country, Russia de facto, in terms of its possession, was able to occupy the Crimean Peninsula. They did so in a very underhanded fashion. They backed Russian-speaking and pro-ethnically Russian militia forces, and they deployed special operations forces without insignia, so they wouldn't be recognized as officially Russian military forces. These are Putin's little green men. Russia also then sponsored humanitarian convoys into the eastern parts of the country, particularly the oblasts around Luhansk and Donetsk, which are obviously currently focuses of the Russian offensive effort in the east. And since that time, the 7 or 8 years since then, we've essentially had an ongoing, very, very tumultuous civil conflict in Ukraine that's taken thousands of lives on both sides. It's damaged infrastructure. And for our purposes here today, it had the interesting effect of providing Russia with a test ground, a laboratory of sorts, in which they could try every dirty trick in the book, psychological warfare, electronic warfare, cyber operations. And they did so to some terrifying effect. The Ukrainian soldiers over the past 7, 8 years that were deployed in the east to fight for their country, these soldiers were fighting in their own country. They had their smartphones, they'd post pictures to Instagram and Facebook and Twitter, and they'd send text messages, of them on the front lines back to their parents, that kind of thing. And the Russians figured out exactly how to take the geotagged information out of those photos and call down airstrikes on those people. They would fly drones overhead of Ukrainian positions and hack into cell phones, take contact lists, and text the contents of those lists, people's moms, brothers, girlfriends, boyfriends, fathers, and they'd say, hey, you're going to find your son's body when the snow melts. They also conducted over the past 5-6 years, major cyber attacks, two of which I note on these slides, Black Energy and NotPetya, which were unprecedented in the view of the global community. Black Energy was a malware attack in 2015 that actually succeeded for the first time outside of a laboratory setting in code basically turning the grid off, denying hundreds of thousands of people access to electricity for hours at a time. And there was actually something even more malicious behind that attempt. They failed, a piece of code failed, but the idea was that when Ukrainian engineers went to turn everything back on, they were hopefully going to turn off the fail-safe governors at the same time they did that and fry the substations and injure people inside. And they didn't manage to get that actually working at the time. NotPetya in 2017, some of you may be affected by this. This was a large ransomware attack, and it was what we call worm-enabled. It was a ransomware attack, essentially, that could self-propagate. And so while the Russians targeted it at Ukraine, it quickly spread beyond Ukrainian borders. And it hit companies across the West. It hit, quite famously, some major shipping firms like Maersk. Many of you have probably seen that name on the side of shipping containers. It's a Dutch company, runs about a fifth of the world's shipping. There were trucks, ships at ports that just stood there. They couldn't do anything for a week. There were no port manifests, so they couldn't unload their shipments. Nobody knew where things were going. This was an unprecedented attack that cost $11.5–12 billion to set straight. And so these are all the externalities of what we've seen to this point in the digital dimension of Russian-Ukrainian hostilities. So now we have something different, though. This is a new phase of the conflict. If we can go to the next slide, please. So now we have a somewhat different cyber conflict on our hands. You see, over the past 6 or 7 years, the Ukrainians, one thing that the really tragic experience they've had since 2014 has done for them, though, is it's moved them from being quite reactive when it comes to digital threats, information warfare threats, propaganda threats, to being quite proactive. One of the major problems that Ukraine suffered in 2014, 15, 16, as Russia was upping its involvement and its interference in the country, one of the problems that they had was that Ukraine's communications infrastructure was all old Soviet infrastructure, as in the Russians knew, they already had mapped it out. They knew exactly where everything went. They already had backdoors and exploits mapped out across systems. Ukraine has, with Western help, substantially drawn down their reliance on that kind of communications infrastructure. They've become less of a reactive country when it comes to cyber attacks, and a little bit more of a proactive one, and a more careful in how they use their technology country. So what do we have today? Today we see over the past 2 to 3 months, since February 24th, when the invasion started, at least 428 major attacks. These have included attacks on communications infrastructure, that is telecoms networks, that is satellite operating companies, as well as the disruption of thousands of government websites and services. This is on both sides as well. This is in Russia and in Ukraine. We're talking about upwards of 5,500 websites linked to the government in different ways on both sides, having been disrupted and taken offline in the 3 months or so since the war started. And there's also been a pretty consistent set of attacks against media outlets, as well as the infrastructure of social services in Ukraine in particular. Right from the outset of the conflict, one major focal point of Russian hacking was consumer records and medical records. There was a major hack, for example, of basically of their equivalent of VDOT, or the Department of Transportation in the federal government, where they stole information on everybody who had a car registered to them, the address that car was registered to. This is the kind of information, of course, that's quite useful if you're planning an invasion and you would like to substantially squeeze civilian population centers so as to make evacuation difficult, so as to put the pressure on the government that you're attacking to capitulate. And there's been a lot of both celebrity and political elites targeting as well, particularly by pro-Ukrainian hackers targeting anybody that's linked to Vladimir Putin, anybody that's linked to oligarchs in the country, those that run Russian state media, and that kind of thing. The financial costs of the conflict so far are very difficult to estimate. I mean, extremely difficult. We're likely talking at least $14 billion worth of damages just from a variety of cyber attacks we've seen over the past several months. But that's a figure, and I'm happy to talk about that more in Q&A. That's a figure that is very hard to get a hold of, particularly because so much of what we're seeing in the digital domain, of course, is being placed alongside physical destruction. The Russians in recent weeks, and I'll get back to this, they've started actually timing their cyber attacks to some degree against battlefield operations. And that's something we didn't see at the very start of the conflict. And so a good example of that is they threatened a variety of hacks, basically of takedowns against the mouthpieces of the Ukrainian state, TV channels and the social media accounts of the Ukrainian president and other politicians, the mayor of Kyiv and Kharkiv and so on and so forth. And they did this about 2 hours before they launched missiles at TV stations across the northern part of the country. So it's difficult to parse apart damage that's caused exclusively by what occurs in cyberspace and what occurs more broadly in the course of this shooting war. There have been widespread disinformation campaigns. They're exactly what you might expect. They're kind of a continuation of much of what we've seen for the past 6 or 7 years. In and around Mariupol, many of you probably know the Ukrainians fought hard to keep Mariupol for a very long time. Mariupol has essentially been razed, it's been leveled, it's barely a city at this point, but a contingent of the Ukrainian military has been holding out there until just the past few days when they finally were able to evacuate, and Ukraine announced that the military mission, the combat mission in Mariupol is now over. They were able to basically hold Russian forces in the area so that Ukrainian forces could operate more freely in other parts of the east of the country. But in that case, one part of the Russian effort for the past 2 months to take Mariupol has been propaganda, hacking into cell phone records, getting the contact information for residents of the area and texting them that the soldiers are leaving, they're abandoning you, that kind of thing, the psychological warfare element of this. It's also highly likely at this point that cyber operations have been linked to thousands of casualties. Again, this is something that's really hard to quantify. If you take an example like the one I just spoke of, where consumer records were hacked and clearly have been deployed towards combat goals, towards keeping certain parts of the civilian population pinned down, unable to access evacuation corridors, given that Russia, after the early days of the war, really turned to focus on what we call a counter-population strategy, hurting the Ukrainian people as much as possible in order to coerce the government and the military to capitulate. It's highly likely that we are able, in the months and years to come, to link the many casualties to cyber operations in and of themselves. The next slide, please. So I think a little bit of clarification is warranted before we go on here. What we're talking about in the war is it is not what many people call a cyber war. And you can see this most clearly, I think, in a lot of the rhetoric and a lot of the narrative that was abounding in the first month or so, actually the month kind of prior to the outbreak of hostilities and in the month or so thereafter. There was this really common narrative, and you see it all the time, even when it's not directly related to Ukraine. You see it all over the place in punditry and commentary and media reporting, and even some expert analysis when we think about cyber security and insecurity broadly. When is the next cyber Pearl Harbor coming? When is the next cyber 9/11 going to rear its head? Well, with Ukraine, there was this expectation that there was going to be a blitzkrieg, right? Russia was going to make basically the world fall down around Ukrainians' shoulders as best they could, entirely via digital means. Utilities going offline, no access to government services, the grid goes off, that kind of thing, in preparation for a military operation. But the thing about it is we didn't see that. We didn't see that. And so while this has been a very diverse and quite an intense conflict in cyberspace, we didn't see anything along the lines of a highly militarized effort to cripple Ukraine in cyberspace or via cyberspace. And that's not all that surprising for those of us that do this. The next slide, please. So this isn't all that surprising because a lot of researchers they've known this for a long time. Even a lot of high-level practitioners, of course, know this as well. But cyber operations aren't particularly good for battlefield effects. One of the main things we have to remember when we're talking about disruption or harm, so to speak, in the digital domain is that we're almost always talking about temporary effects. There's only 3, arguably maybe 4 times where a piece of code has been employed to actually affect a physically destructive outcome, where a piece of machinery broke or an explosion happened or something along those lines. When we're talking about cyber operations, we're talking about taking websites offline or disrupting access to networks or wiping information off of hard drives, that kind of thing. And these are temporary victories. You can always patch systems, you can plug new ones in, you can move back to using legacy computer systems. You can upgrade your cybersecurity effort. You can basically fix whatever problem is brought to you in cyberspace in a matter of hours if you're fortunate, but days or a couple of weeks at most in almost all circumstances. And the result of that is that cyber operations don't really help militaries control territory. There are not really many good augmentative battlefield effects you get from launching cyber operations alongside military operations, certainly not on the scale that would have been required for it to be attractive for someone like Putin, who was obviously focused on invading the entirety of Ukraine back in February. We also, when we're thinking about cyber operations and what it looked like in the early days of this conflict, we have to think about the parochial context, I like to think of it as, of the Russian government, particularly the kind of political, social culture within the Russian state. So for one thing, Putin expected a fairly quick and easy victory. We can talk about the sources of that and kind of how ridiculous that seems now. But from his point of view, why would you launch cyber operations that were meant to essentially debilitate the state, to take utilities offline, to cause hundreds of thousands of people to be without electricity? Why would you launch those kinds of attacks if your belief is that a lightning strike is going to get you what you want in a matter of days, right? You're the one that then has to actually deal with the recovery from the attack that you launched in the first place. Don't break what you're about to buy, basically. There's also the fact that a lot of Russia's cyber capability, we've realized this in the course of this conflict. The Russians are incredibly cyber capable. We've known this for decades. They have been the primary cyber bogeyman, I think, of this country and other Western states for the past decade and a half. But a lot of their capability to disrupt Western societies in different and interesting ways has come from their reliance on non-state actors, particularly cyber criminal gangs. And what we've seen in this conflict so far is that a lot of these cyber criminal entities have a kind of blended economic and political identity, by which I mean you get cyber criminal ransomware gangs that Russia was relying on to act in cyberspace on its behalf in the opening phases of this conflict. And they actually weren't all that able to. They had their own internal issues to deal with. When one gang, almost the most famous one in the world called Conti, put out a full-throated support of Putin's invasion of Ukraine, there was an internal rebellion. Because they're a criminal outfit, right? They employ hackers from all across the world, including Ukraine and other countries that weren't really fully in support of this military invasion of a sovereign nation. And so there was almost a rebellion from within. And so Russia didn't just have a very kind of limited incentive to employ cyber operations in a very militaristic fashion in the opening phases of this conflict. It also didn't necessarily have the wherewithal to match cyber abilities against its battlefield operations. The next slide, please. And so what we've basically got here is a war that is disruption, it's a lot of sabotage, and it's a lot of subversion, but it's not really a lot of war fighting. You couldn't really characterize most of what we've seen in cyberspace as war fighting. Over the past couple of months, we have seen a lot of varied attacks the likes of which we've seen for the past 7 or 8 years. And they've happened, more intensely and in a shorter time frame, as one might expect when you've got a shooting war going on. But it's mostly more of what we've had since 2014 or so. We've had attacks where malware is employed to just wipe hard drives, to just cause general chaos and again, I'm hesitant to use the word destruction, but disruption, I suppose. Major DDoS attacks in the dozens against services and sites across Ukraine, as well as hitting Western governments as well, particularly those in Central and Eastern Europe, which have proven to be those governments that are most willing and most full-throated in their support of Ukraine, the Poles, the Slovenians, the Czechs, that kind of thing. Ukrainian government services are also pretty persistently unavailable because of a lot of targeted disruption by Russian hackers. And this includes basic services, the kind of things like casualty hotlines where people are able to call in to check on the status of their sons and daughters serving in the military. Those hotlines have been targeted persistently from the second or third week in the war. There have been further attacks. In fact, probably the most significant and severe attack we've seen so far in Ukraine has been sort of mirroring that Black Energy attack on the energy grid back in 2015, a similar malware framework used by the same, we call them APTs, but threat actors, a Russian hacking group, basically. We've seen attempts to take out part of the grid to just disrupt civilian life. That was foiled, thankfully, but it's likely that we'll see more along those lines. And then we have seen, as I mentioned previously, quite a lot of efforts on the part of the Russians to take out commercial communications. One thing that the Russians clearly didn't realize in the opening rounds of this conflict is that the Ukrainians have managed to move away from a reliance on old Soviet infrastructure, particularly communications infrastructure, for their military operations, and they rely largely on Western commercial communication firms. Elon Musk's Starlink has played a substantial role in this conflict, and the Russians have tried to hit a lot of firms in the intervening time since they kind of realized this as a means of disrupting Ukrainian military operations on the ground. Next slide, please. I think this is, yeah, thank you. Putin is right about one thing here, and I'm wary about even saying something like that, but Putin's right about one thing in this conflict, which is that to portray this as just the Russian government versus the Ukrainian government, or even the Ukrainian people versus the Russian people, is to oversimplify this. Now, when Putin says that, of course, he's making this argument that this is a proxy war between Russia and NATO, or Russia and the West more broadly. That's certainly not what I'm saying, but he's right that this is not simply two-sided. There are certainly in cyberspace a few core government hacking entities operating on behalf of their governments, but in actual fact, the war in cyberspace is really the war of proxies, dozens of different groups, some that have been basically put together and coordinated with by the states, the Russian government, the Ukrainian government, the Belarusian government as well. And then a lot of independent hacking groups, hacktivist collectives, little artist groups, all manner of different kind of individual that have banded together to fight for one side or another. And then increasingly on the Russian side over the past month and a half or so, we are seeing finally the return of a lot of criminal groups that are being conscripted to some degree and used to cause chaos where they can amidst the battle-ridden situation in eastern Ukraine. And I have a map here in the next slide, if we can go to that, that shows you a little bit of what I'm talking about in terms of how diverse this conflict actually is. So I put this map together. This shows you a map of Ukraine and Russia, obviously. The red areas are this is not where the lines currently stand. This is all areas within which Russia has launched campaign attacks. So in the north, near Kyiv, in that initial phase of the war where they attempted to take the capital in a lightning strike, and then to regroup and to launch a more major operation against the capital. That phase of the war is obviously now over. The Ukrainians won the Battle of Kyiv, there's no doubt about that. But now we have operations near Kharkiv, Mariupol, Kherson has been retaken, but there are still operations in the south with Russian forces operating out of Crimea, hitting targets in Odessa occasionally. So within all of this, you can see that you have a great many non-state proxies fighting for both sides. On the Ukrainian side in particular, there has been a groundswell of support both within Ukraine and from across the West, particularly in Europe, but I know of people here in Richmond who have operated on behalf of Ukraine. It's easy to get in touch with the right communications channels to basically be organized into what they're calling their IT army, their IT cyber army. This is basically volunteers in the hundreds of thousands that are being utilized to do everything from support Ukraine's serious cyber operations against Russian targets, to do basic things like denial of service attacks just to disrupt Russian media outlets, to try and splice war footage onto Russian web pages, to hit banks that are owned by oligarchs, to steal information that is scandalous or that is operated on behalf of a Russian state service provider, which is typically one that is oligarch owned. On the Russian side of things, we have a somewhat less diverse landscape of non-state proxies, insofar as we're mostly not talking about pro-Russian partisans essentially fighting on behalf of either the Russian or Belarusian government and hacking Ukrainian targets, but there are a great many different cyber criminal gangs, cyber criminal outfits, as well as a lot of actors some of which we've not heard of until recently, but we're thinking the kind of formal assessments you're seeing coming out of companies like Microsoft, parts of the intelligence community here in the West and in the United Kingdom and France. We think they're parts of Russian hacking groups linked to the government that we've seen in years past, and they've just kind of reformed themselves into new elements, to new groups, giving themselves different names, different mission priorities, and that kind of thing. And then the last thing you'll know here, and we can go to the next slide as we say this, the last thing you'll see here is that Anonymous has played a substantial role in this conflict. Anonymous has organized a great many people in different hacking groups, collectives, basically to name and shame parts of Russian society and to what we call politically crack the Russian government. That is to say, providing the Russian people both information that they are not easily able to come by themselves, providing them with the tools to access information that they may be getting denied right now by Russian internet information controls, and that kind of thing. They've also stolen and published terabytes upon terabytes of private information, much of it scandalous, much of it simply focused on giving Russians and giving others around the world some measure of an understanding of how the criminal state that Putin runs actually works. We can go to the next slide, please. And I realize I'm going very slightly long here, so let me just walk you past the last couple of slides very quickly. So the phase of the conflict we're in right now, that's okay. The phase of the conflict we're in right now, just very briefly, it has changed a little bit from the early days of the war. We are increasingly seeing cyber operations, as I've already mentioned, being timed against battlefield operations. This is not really a reflection of cyber operations being used for battlefield effect, but rather that now that Russia has got its cyber operations game back to where it likely should have been at the start of the war, they're just starting to coordinate more than they were from the outset. One thing that's a real positive we can take from what we've seen over the past month or two, ransomware attacks coming out of Russia are dropping away. A lot of companies, a lot of service providers and state governments that monitor this are reporting drops 30, 40, 50% or more in terms of ransomware threats coming out of Russia. This is likely because sanctions are hitting the Russian economy, they're hitting Russian society, and they're causing a great deal of stress on the cyber criminal gangs that usually would be behind these operations. Russia itself, however, is getting harder to attack. For pro-Ukrainian forces, the steps that the Russian government has recently taken to limit internet controls in the country are having an effect. Russia is setting itself up as a bit of an internet walled garden, and that really is making it harder for us to make inroads into their information infrastructure. The next slide, please. So what do we know about the conflict so far? Well, a few different things. One is that researchers that work on cyber operations, I think, called it right. We have said for years that cyber operations are not about war fighting. They're about other things, right? They're about shaping favorable conditions. They're about sabotage and subversion and espionage. And that's exactly what we've seen in this conflict. We've also seen, I think, a lot of validation of us having pushed back against this idea that a lot of folk believe that cyber attacks are cheap. They're easy to create, to deploy, while defending against them is incredibly expensive. But the thing about it is, building effective and sophisticated attacks also takes time, it takes money, it takes infrastructure. And the fact that Russia wasn't essentially able to take advantage of how powerful we've perceived them to be in cyberspace at the outset of this conflict is evidence of that, because Russia has been focused on disruption, political interference, espionage, that kind of thing in the last 10 or 15 years. And that's not what was required to really make a splash, to make an effect in the opening rounds of this conflict. And then finally, I would say that, you know, digital weapons, they're counter society weapons. Ukraine's experience over the past 7 or 8 years has made them a much more resilient society, both in terms of their infrastructure, their people, and its identity as a people under fire, their mechanisms of government. They've become a lot more resilient to these kinds of informational and digital threats. And the result has been that Ukraine has fared far better than many people, I think, previously would have expected in this conflict. And again, that's a reflection of societal resilience more than it is some basic technical capability to do cyber defense better. So there are 2 more slides here, which are essentially just what can we expect out of Russia to come in years to come, in months to come. Let me just summarize these very quickly so we can get on to the Q&A. What can we expect from Russia in the months to come? In the near term, not necessarily a lot. We've seen an uptick in Russian attacks on Western infrastructure over the past month or so, but we've not seen an uptick in the disruptiveness or the severity of attacks. It looks like Russia is preparing for the long game. They're re-upping their commitment to having a good set of hooks into Western society, in our governing institutions, our companies, our infrastructure, our mechanisms of social interaction. But right now, what we're seeing is a reflection of sanctions hitting the Russian people hard, brain drain, which has sent tens of thousands, almost 100,000 of their best and brightest from the tech industry fleeing to other countries. And the fracturing of the cyber criminal ecosystem that worked so well for Putin prior to the war, but has now had to be reformed to fit wartime objectives. If we can just go to the last slide, please. And so there's a lot of factors that are going to gauge whether or not we can expect Russia to be extremely aggressive in years to come, next year and on out from there. It's likely that we're facing a Russia that is going to be geopolitically isolated, as well as a bit of a moral pariah. Their economy is not going to be as strong as it has been at pretty much any point in history, and that's largely because of the devaluation of their commodities industry as energy sectors across Europe and North America move to reliance on other forms of energy. They have a distinct, because of sanctions, lack of access already to the high technologies that are useful for building a tech sector, for technology innovation, for military innovation particularly. And like I said, they're suffering from mass brain drain. On top of all of that, they've also started walling themselves off, moving to the China model of internet governance, where basically information is meant to stay within Russia and the state is going to control exactly what Russians can see. And the result of all of this is, well, it's variable. We don't really know necessarily what is going to come of Russia down the line. It seems likely, though, that they will increasingly turn back to cyber operations to get around their isolation, to make money when they're being prevented from making money through other either illicit or legitimate reasons, to put pressure on parts of Western society, where they're unable to do so militarily or diplomatically, and that kind of thing. And particularly as the technologies in the West with AI and everything jump ahead of Russia, who simply will not be able to keep up at this point, given the sanctions, given the brain drain, given the lack of access to high technologies from elsewhere in the world. Again, you can see cyber being the game changer in their minds, right? The thing that might let them overcome so many of the disadvantages that they've now accrued just by dint of launching what amounts to a foolish campaign against a neighbor that was much better prepared than they thought it was. And so with that, I've gone quite long. Let me go ahead and we'll jump to question and answer. But again, thank you for having me, and I'm looking forward to chatting more about this.
Great. Chris, we'll jump right into the questions, and please continue to post questions as we go. The first question, do you think Russian fears retaliation for mass cyber attacks on Ukraine and other Western countries, which may cause more disruptions to their current economic state?
Do I think that Russia fears?
Yes.
No, I don't think that Russia fears cyber attacks over and above what they have experienced over the past several months. It's not necessarily likely, I think, that Western countries are going to be inclined towards major attacks on Russian infrastructure. And the reason for that is that signaling is very hard in cyberspace. If we were to launch major cyber attacks, and by we, I mean government forces in the West, from the United States or European partners, if we were to launch major cyber attacks against Russia, it would have to be done in such a specific fashion that the message we were sending was clear. And we would only do it, again, because remember what I said about essentially temporary effects. A cyber attack by itself is not going to give you a battlefield advantage. It is only going to disrupt, to degrade, to sabotage temporarily. Because of that, we would only launch a cyber attack against the Russians if we were trying to send a very specific message. And again, that can be incredibly difficult to do in cyberspace because of the attribution challenge, and because when you hack, there's not actually a message, so to speak. It's not necessarily easy to interpret what was meant by a particular, piece of code that you find, a particular system that gets shut off, that kind of thing. So I think the Russians expect to be on the receiving end of the broad scope disruption from pro-Ukrainian and pro-Western forces that they've now been on the receiving end of for the past 3 months. I think they expect that to continue, and they'd be foolish not to. But I don't think they fear an escalation of sorts in cyberspace, not at all.
Okay, the next question. Ukraine is winning the information operations war with Russia and is due to its ability to communicate a clear and concise narrative in its favor. Do you think this is due to Ukraine's cyber operations?
Not entirely, no. There's a cyber tie-in, right? So I think that in terms of Ukrainian messaging and Ukrainian narrative, I think obviously Zelensky and those around him have much to be lauded for in terms of how they built their narrative platform, their PR platform, engaged the West. There was this, and there still is to a substantial degree, but there's this nice balance between kind of encouraging and motivating the West to stand up for democratic values, to stand up for those who are fighting for those values, and also, accusing us of potentially failing to meet the call. I think the way that was handled was almost singularly significant in building the case for Ukrainian aid, defensive aid, right? The internal messaging, again, I don't know if there's a distinct cyber operations component of this, but the internal messaging, right, where the country itself has been found quite resilient to disinformation, to acts of propagandizing. That to some degree, I think we can thank the experience of the Ukrainians with Russian digital interference over the past 7 or 8 years. We can thank a lot of the lessons we learned there. And I've been on a couple of kind of task forces. I've never been the one that went to Ukraine, but I've been on task forces where colleagues went and they met individuals. They met some of the cyber units that were operating there and reported back. And on the basis of American advice, your other European countries' advice, the Ukrainians have moved away from reliance on Soviet-era infrastructure. They have encouraged widespread use of interpersonal communications using encrypted applications built by Western firms, things like WhatsApp and Telegram and so on. They've moved the information foundations of the Ukrainian state, Ukrainian society, to a much more secure footing. And I think that overall has made them, as a country, much less susceptible to the psychological warfare efforts that we've seen so blatantly since day one of this war.
Okay, this question is a little different. What is going on in Costa Rica now with cyber terrorism from the Conti gang? Why would Russian language cyber actors be targeting Costa Rica of all places?
Well, so Conti is a cyber criminal gang, right? They're a ransomware outfit. They're actually probably the most famous and well-to-do ransomware outfit in the world. Last year, their revenue stream was something like $180 million. I mean, they do very well for themselves. They are they're also one of these outfits that had an identity crisis. I mentioned them specifically, in fact, early on in the war, where you have this kind of almost like blended political and economic identity. And that led to somewhat less of a credible, full-throated support in terms of employing actual cyber capabilities for Putin's government than I think they would have absolutely liked to have happen. So what we're seeing, though, now in the past month or so is a lot of cyber criminal gangs that really went silent for a while. They're getting back on their feet. They're launching attacks elsewhere in the world, and we're seeing Russia or Russian-based criminals pick up the activities that they were famous for, they were known for the past decade prior to the outset of this conflict. This, to some degree, I think is a signal that Russia, again, is planning for the medium to long term, that it understands that their ability to pressure Western societies in cyberspace, oftentimes by doing quite ridiculous things, is going to be definitive in letting them weather the crisis of isolation in years to come. I haven't gotten into the Costa Rican situation that much, so I can't say honestly. I'm perfectly happy to say I don't know, and I can't say that much more about it. I've read headlines and that kind of thing, but it's the end of term and I had grades due, but that's a reflection of what we're seeing in that incident and many others. We've started to see ransomware attacks on hospitals in the US and the UK and so on. Again, that's what we're seeing. A recognition on the part of the Russians that they need to sort of return to what they've been doing as part of building this foundation for weathering isolation.
Okay, is there a general estimate of what percentage of cyber attacks attempted fail versus succeed?
No, not really. It's success and failure are extremely hard to define as well. Oftentimes, a cyber operation will be launched in order to insert a piece of malware that can at some juncture turn on, take over part of an industrial control system and shut down a factory, shut down part of the grid, that kind of thing. And oftentimes it fails to do so. But in order to have undertaken this operation to begin with, there was a great amount of intelligence gathering, there was a great amount of network penetration and compromise that occurred, giving the malicious actor access to networks, allowing them to spy on, an industrial control vendor or a part of a foreign government or that kind of thing. And so is that a successful or an unsuccessful operation? Because there's still a gain that has been had to the malicious cyber actor, the threat actor in that case. The main reason, of course, why we don't know how many attacks are unsuccessful is that if it doesn't work, how would you know it even happened in many cases?
Okay, would it be accurate to say that attacks against battlefield infrastructure take skills or experience current criminal attackers may not possess.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's true. I think there's an important lesson to be had from this conflict, which is that you can often explain the actions, whether it be battlefields, espionage, electronic warfare, cyber operations, whatever. You can often explain the actions of a particular, let's just say, country, or a non-state actor by whatever capabilities they had on hand at the time. There's a lot of scholarship that has basically said the Russian way of cyber war, which is quite distinct from the way that we do it. It's very distinct from the way that the Chinese do it or the Iranians do it. It's a function of their institutions. It's a function of the prominence of their intelligence establishment and its conventional ties to organized crime. And it's a function of their historical experiences at the end of the Cold War, where you essentially had a large exodus from the Soviet military, industrial intelligence complex. You had a large number of personnel going back into society, and they had certain skills, or they only knew one way of life, and they were co-opted. They move into organized criminal outfits. They were co-opted by intelligence outfits, that kind of thing. Yeah, absolutely. There's oftentimes a path dependency that sometimes you can just explain why an actor, why a country, why a gang does what it does, because it's what they had on hand, and it's what they knew how to do. It's the skill set that they had.
Okay, as Russia starts to ramp up its attacks in the future, do you see them targeting new or different targets, such as healthcare facilities?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're going to see, I think that would be a return to targeting healthcare facilities. I do think so. One assertion that I've seen repeated again and again, and I'm not going to tell you this is right or not, but it seems credible, it seems feasible, right? Is that Russia might go the North Korea model of approach, which is to say that North Korea is incredibly isolated and often turns to different kinds of cyber attacks, ransomware in particular, to fund itself, to get money that it would otherwise be unable to access because of sanctions that are put in place against that country. Russia may find itself in a similar position. And so targets that are, hospitals are a really good example of this, targets that are wealthy enough, that have a clear and present need to quickly unlock data. These are high value targets, and they're the kind of thing that I think we could very, very feasibly see Russia stepping up the tempo of their attacks against across the West over the next few years. Absolutely.
Okay, thank you, Chris. We do have a number of other questions. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time to answer those questions at this time. Thank you all for being here today and listening to Chris's presentation. I'm going to turn it back over to Mr. Dozer.
Thanks, Jim. And thank you, Chris. This was a great, engaging conversation about such a relevant topic. I mean, if you turn on your news or, you open your newspaper, all the things that were discussed today will probably inform you going forward. And so I do appreciate our speaker for taking the time to deliver such pertinent information. In terms of what we have coming up in the next Lunch and Learn, which is going to be on June 22nd at noon, we'll be discussing inflation with Catherine Bond, the Vice President and Public Policy and State Affairs at Dominion Energy. So we look forward to seeing everyone here who attended at our next Lunch and Learn, again, where we discuss rising costs, rising inflation, making sense of the economy. And so we want to thank you all for joining us today. Thank you to our communications team who is working in the background. Thank you to our speakers, Professors James Keck and Professor Christopher White, as well as our Dean, Susan Gooden. Thank you all for joining us and participating, and we hope you have a great rest of your afternoon.